Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first panel. This covers the industrial journey to AI adoption under proper governance. Moderating the panel will be Ms. Danielle Jiang from the AI Development Office of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, Singapore Central Bank. Ms. Jiang devotes time to empowering people with technology and data science skills in order to make more intelligent financial decisions. She's also committed to, I think, positively impacting a lot of the different, making a positive impact on the financial industry through a role at the AI Development Office, where she works as an assistant director. Danielle, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle. I'm from the AI Development Office and Monetary Authority of Singapore. I'm actually currently running this program called FinTech, which stands for Finance, AI, and Marketplace. And this is part of the AI development mandate from MAS. I'm very happy to be here and collaborating with RegTech with this RegTech Summit with a great focus on AI and data analytics. So this panel is about the industry journey to AI adoption, which is under proper governance. And we want to focus on the governance more. And we have a group of industry experts with very diverse background. So I'll go around for introducing to you the speakers. So firstly, we have Hiroki Habuka, who is a Deputy Director, Global Digital Governance at the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry of Japan. Hi, Hiroki. Over to you.
Hi, Danielle, and good morning. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay,
would you, introduce yourself? Maybe
a short
background. What you do?
Yeah, of course. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. So I'm Hiroki Habuka. I'm working for the Digital Governance Division of METI, Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. So I'm in charge of designing a new governance framework for a digitalized society, including AI, of course, but also privacy protection, data security, and digital platform regulation, etc. And today I'd like to introduce the concept of Agile governance, which is a new framework to realize various goals into actual systems in this rapid changing society. So I'm very looking forward to this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll hear from you on your expertise later. Yeah, move to the next speaker will be Vijay Jairaj, who's the head CFCC data management risk and focus on responsible AI and the Standard Chartered Bank based in Singapore. Hi, Vijay.
Hi, Danielle. Morning and morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. Good to be here, and thanks to RegPac for having me on the panel. It's an honor. As part of my role as the head of data management risk for responsible AI, I set the standards and policies at Standard Chartered across the group, across all our jurisdictions, for using AI responsibly. So in this second line role, I work with various other second line teams like model risk management, data quality, data privacy, cybersecurity, and a whole bunch of other teams in order to set up our governance structures around using responsible AI. In addition, I also work with various first line teams, the data scientists, the machine learning engineers, and the businesses in order to ensure that we implement the governance structures that we come up with. So I'm fortunate to have both a holistic top-level view of what's happening in AI within the bank, as well as a view from the trenches. I look forward to sharing that. I'm very keen to hear from Hiroki on the agile governance as we progress in this discussion. Back to you, Danielle.
Thank you, Vijay. Now the next speaker will be Michelle Katics. Hi, Michelle. Michelle is a co-founder and CEO of BankersLab, PortfolioQuest. She's also a FinTech mentor. Hi, Michelle. Would you give the audience a few lines of your introduction?
Good morning, Danielle, and thank you for hosting this panel, and thanks to RegPac for organizing it. At BankersLab and PortfolioQuest, we focus on using simulation and hands-on learning to train members of the financial industry to implement all kinds of things, such as risk management frameworks, to optimize their portfolio performance, etc. As such, we're always, we work in about 30 countries around the world, although predominantly in Southeast Asia. And really, some of the voice I'll bring to this discussion are some of the pain points seen that, also Vijay will be feeling in his everyday life around, the boots on the ground, the challenges of, people trying to, in their line management jobs in financial institutions, to understand how these solutions work and try to integrate it into their, process flow, et cetera. So I'll try to bring the voice of our clients, the financial institutions, to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Now the next one will be Michael Gibbs, who is the founder and the president of SureStep. Hi, Michael.
Hey, how are you? So thank you very much to RegPack and Mona for having me along on this. Really appreciate it. I think, I'm going to bring a slightly different viewpoint to this than pretty much everyone else. My company, SureStep, we do systems integration. So we actually build AI-powered regulatory management systems. So we're kind of in between everybody else on this panel. So we see a bit of a unique view from the top and the bottom, and then specifically some of the difficulties with the systems and where the data management side and data governance of affects how the upstream data is used, whether it's from a client or how it impacts employees at a given company who are using AI systems internally. There's a number of different areas there that we impact and that we build systems for. So I think we're going to be bringing a slightly different view to this, which is great, and really looking forward to the panel. There's some really, really bright people on here, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say.
Thank you. Now, the last speaker, but not the least, will be Joanne Barefoot, who's the CEO and a co-founder at the Alliance for Innovation Regulation, also co-founder at the Hummingbird RegTech. Hi, Joanne.
Hi, Danielle, and thank you for having me. And I want to commend RegPack for putting together this really important program, and thank MAS also for sponsoring our panel. Yes, I'm the CEO of the Alliance for Innovative Regulation, or AIR. We are a nonprofit organization based in the United States, but working with global scope. And our focus is on this financial realm, although many of the issues we are working with are broader than that. And we're especially focused on helping the regulatory community keep up with today's technology change, which I'm a former bank regulator in the United States myself. I was deputy controller of the currency here. And we know that the regulatory and government institutions that we have are not built for the rapid change that is coming at them and the novel kinds of risks that are arising from AI and many other new kinds of technology. So we work on that. So my perspective on the panel is going to be thinking from the standpoint of the government, regulators and policymakers and risk managers on how can we be sure to get AI right and be confident that people can trust in what it's doing for us.
Okay. I think we lost Joanne for a while. I think that's due to the internet connection. Yeah, maybe when the host is solving out the technical issue, I think it's a great introduction for everyone, and I think we are perfectly to maybe kick off the discussion. So Joanne may join back later and address some of the key important questions.
I think we lost.
I think it was Danielle we lost. I think Joanne.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Yeah.
No worries. I think Danielle's having some issues with her connection. So I think she's returned. Okay. Welcome back, Danielle.
Oh, okay. I thought it's Joanne. It's Can you hear me right now?
Yes. Would it help if we plunge into the topic while we sort out the technology?
Yes, I think perhaps let's dive right in so that we can. So Joanne, when we left off with you.
Yeah, I'm happy to start.
Please continue.
And thinking about this at a very broad level, it seems to me that how we're going to use data as a society is the issue of our age. We've had AI for more than a half century. People predicted for decades that it was going to change everything, and it didn't. People started to ignore it. And the thing that was missing was the availability of high volumes of digital data that the AI could work on. So now we have both. We have the confluence of the explosion of data that we are living with and the ability to analyze and use it with AI tools. And I think we're just at the first frontier of working our way globally through how we're going to do this well. We know that there's massive upside opportunity in being able to use AI. It can make the financial system and everything else work better. It can open opportunities and inclusion for more people. It can help us deal with the fact that many of the tools that we have today are sort of blunt instruments. You know, we don't have finely tuned. Michelle, Danielle, it looks like you're back, so that's great.
Yeah.
But I'm just making a few comments to get us started. We have a lot of people who are excluded from opportunities or scored on their risk and so on because traditional information didn't give us enough insight into them. So now we have the opportunity to really have a much more effective system in every way, but coming with a lot of potential downside risk. When we think about fairness in this system, we worry that people will lose privacy. We worry that people will be at risk of data insecurity and cyber threat. And then we worry that that we're going to run the risk of bias as we use AI, either because the AI has been trained on biased data that imported human biases in a structured system, or because the AI is working with unstructured data and it teaches itself bias without our being able to catch it properly. Some of you remember when Microsoft put out its emotional empathetic robot, Tay, and they had to remove her within a day because she learned online to be racist.
Yeah, I think that's a
yes,
very
I
good,
remember the Tay episode. I think that was interesting at so many levels. And if you can oversimplify what AI does, it basically figures out the rules based on tons of data. As Joanne said, the availability of data is what enables AI. And there's a lot to unpack in that kind of oversimplified statement. So when we talk of learning the rules from the data, first of all, you're as good as your data is. And if you look at the historical example of Amazon coming up with a CV screening system, they had accurate data, except that that data was inherently biased. It reflected historical bias. Historically, Amazon hired more men than women in technology, and their AI system learned to reject women's CVs. So it learned that from the data. So that's one aspect. Data quality is very important when it comes to AI. And we got to go beyond the traditional aspects of data quality of just, say, completeness, knowing your data, lineage, and so on. Picking up another point that Joanne made, it's about data bias. You got to debias your data. You got to ensure that you're taking care of outliers because that could lead to overfitting in AI systems. And because it is learning the rules from the data, it's a black box. So you're carrying black box risk. And you're also carrying a risk of accountability. In the traditional systems, you had somebody giving you the rules, someone signing off on it, so you could pinpoint who owned the rules, and you had a chain. The machine is generating the rules here, and the number of lawsuits and the amount of discussion that's happening on various channels about if there is a car accident involving an autonomous car, who's accountable? And those are things that we need to answer if we have to use AI effectively and gain the trust of our customers and stakeholders. I'll stop at that and hand back to Danielle.
Yeah, I think Vijay also made a very good point, and it's actually part of it, like summarize.
I think we still have some sound issues there.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Am I here? Yeah.
I can.
Okay, great. So Vijay actually summarized actually some key points on our FEED principle, stands for fairness, ethics, accountability, and transparency. That's the guideline that MES has issued to the financial industry in 2018, I think. It addressed the data bias and ethics problem. It also addressing the accountability when we integrate AI into the current business processes, and also pretty much on the transparency side on like to make sure that it is not a black box system. It's gonna explain self-explanatory and human can understand what is the rationale behind the decision made by AI. That's a very good summary. I was just wondered because this is a Singapore issued guidelines, whether some of the principles are also applied or on the development in other countries, maybe in Canada or in Japan, or are there other principles that I think it's important. You think it's important to bring in to these topics in AI governance. So maybe looking at maybe from Japan, Hiroki,
Yes,
do you have any things to share on that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can just briefly share my point. So basically, we totally agree with the ethics, like principles which you address, like for example, privacy, security, fairness, transparency, explainability, etc. But what we found in our discussion is that there is not just one goal. There is not a static goal. I mean, along with the change of technologies, societies, or values of people, our goals always change. Of course, the principle doesn't change. Fairness is always important, but what does fairness exactly mean should be different depending on the context. For example, there could be individual fairness or group fairness or counterfactual fairness, and it's impossible to detect or identify only one definition of fairness or privacy or trust. Instead, the system operators, AI developers, or AI operators should define your own definition of this principle and explain it to others. So when you talk about fairness, our system defines fairness as like this way, and then users can decide whether to use this system or not. So that is what we need, we believe. Yeah, that's my comment.
Hiroki, if I can just make a comment about that. In reading your work on the Agile governance, something struck me which I haven't seen elsewhere, which is, yes, you define these goals, but the words happiness and liberty and human rights, it was very interesting to see that because this topic gets very serious. So it was very interesting to see the word happiness in a paper about, it was like the one word that I didn't expect to see in a paper about AI, to see the word happiness as a goal. So I just wanted to applaud you for that in what is usually a very serious topic.
Yeah, maybe happiness sounds like a naive word, but at least we have to make sure that our ultimate goal is not like adoption of AI or develop a sexy system. That our ultimate goal is just to make human beings happier and more freer. And it's almost impossible to find one definition of happiness, but at least we can share that we are going to aim that, and we can continue discussion.
Yes, to have that to articulate those common goals, I think. So just a shout out for that, which is a different dimension on the discussion. So
yeah, and that hasn't changed since the age of Aristotle or even older.
No, and I agree. The goal shouldn't be just AI adoption. The goal is societal goal, and that societal goal is for economic prosperity and yes, fairness and all these things. But why do we care about fairness? It's actually for this purpose of
exactly,
societal economic growth and happiness.
Yeah.
And I think that actually is a really, really good lead-in, right, into kind of an area around where those definitions of fairness come in terms of where does an AI play a role, right? I mean, if we look at, I think everybody here would very easily agree that, client data or the public's data or so on must be protected, right? We talk about data governance and how do we manage that data and where does it go and how does it get protected? That's really, really key. I think one area that gets overlooked a little bit, and probably because we're in that state where we're actually building out these systems. I mean, a lot of the systems that we build, they surveil, traders, they surveil employees. They might be part of a learning tree in an AI-assisted virtual assistant that someone's using to navigate a policy tree within their organization. At what point does the public's rules, I guess, get separated from the individual? Because the individual at work is obviously under a much greater level of surveillance and, I suppose, obligation to their company, right? So if I know that if you're a desk trader, for example, at many banks, you're signing away your life, in terms of privacy. You get access to your social media, access to your private phone, access to a lot of these different things that a regular individual on the street or a client would never in a million years give to a company, right? But they give that away as a part of being employed. And AI, frankly, is learning a lot about them. And actually, before Joanne and I both got on a little bit earlier, and we were talking about this before everyone else came on. But if you think about where people are in that world, at what point does an AI stop thinking about looking for criminal intent or misactions or something along those lines? And where does it start applying bias to essentially say that, okay, this person might not have done something, but based on the biases that learned in the system, it might actually react or tag somebody differently or react differently to somebody or create a different report or a different risk profile for somebody based on bias. And again, I think there's the people who are employed by a company that is using AI, I think get forgotten a little bit in the conversation. And ultimately, for a lot of us, Vijay works at a bank. I work with a lot of financial services companies. I'm sure Joanne in her previous role had an awful lot of obligation to the organization she was a part of, and had to give up a certain degree of privacy to have that role. We probably all have. So to me, that's a part I think doesn't get discussed enough. And I was really kind of curious to see what some people here might think of that and where it should go.
Yeah, definitely. We'll probably move on to the more
if I may
specific
step into that
question.
It's a very interesting point you make.
Thank you, Vijay.
In terms of surveillance, it is not new. Staff surveillance, for example, you've always had this, especially for front office staff, in terms of market abuse, in terms of insider trading. So their communications have been surveilled previously. The advantage and the risk that comes with AI is you can scale up the ability to surveil, which you didn't have previously. So that's a huge, huge advantage. Now, if, as you pointed out, you don't govern it appropriately, that can also become a weapon. You could weaponize bias. So what are seemingly innocuous words in a conversation about, say, catching up for dinner or whatever, could potentially be misinterpreted. And the next thing you know, you're sitting in an investigation and having a disciplinary hearing or a conduct kind of setup. So it could go either way. And that is where I think two things come in. One is having the right kind of governance structures within your institution. And the second thing, which is more important, is education and awareness. So you need a culture change top to bottom to ensure people are aware of the risks of using AI. I was on a panel discussion recently, a different one. And one of the countries where one of the banks had a footprint actually published the names of people who have been identified as COVID positive. Okay, so it's there in the newspapers. And what the analytics team was doing was taking that information, overlaying it with transactional information, and trying to see what were their shopping patterns the couple of weeks leading up to the confirmation, and seeing if they could use that to predict who else is going to get COVID positive. Okay, now think about it. It is legal. They have consent to use the data for analytics, their customer data. It's publicly available information. On the other hand, they are combining the two, but they're using it for the incorrect purpose. Once the management figured this out, they shut it down. So they acted fairly swiftly. But these are the kind of things that can go wrong. Not just governance, it's not just enforcement. You need education, you need a culture change. You need people to be aware of the harms that unmitigated use of AI and uncontrolled use of data can cause.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you've made such an important point that most of the things we would be concerned about are not new. It's just that the AI is so much more powerful, so much more efficient and effective, and so it really creates a step change, even though it, in theory, it might be an incremental change. I think another area to worry about is the ability of the AI really to manipulate people, to know what we're thinking almost better than what we know, and to make us offers that are really hard for us to refuse. People worry about AI, for example, in gaming. We know that the human brain is gaming, and actually like gamified investing is another example that I run into. The human brain is attracted to the endorphins that you get when you win something in a gamble. And so these investment vehicles can be programmed to draw us into trading more so that the offerer is making more money on the trades and so on. And that's nothing new. I mean, people have been selling things to people forever and trying to, convince us that we should take what they're offering. But should we be governing and regulating differently when we know that there's a higher level of potential misuse in some of these activities than we had in the old days?
Yeah, Joanne, that's a point that we address in the workshops that we do with banks, meaning there is rightly a lot of focus on credit assessment models and that they're fair, et cetera. But in many credit scoring models, you're not using sophisticated AI at this point, and it's highly regulated. And some of the AI models are really more used on the marketing, as you're mentioning, right? And that's still, it seems from a regulatory perspective, kind of the Wild West, right? You can there aren't really rules about marketing to people, right? And giving them an offer. There's lots of regulation around credit approvals, which is fine. But on the other hand, what's going to happen when people, in certain groups just don't even receive the best offers because they're in that particular group or geography or whatever. So I think that piece, I'm not sure how well we're addressing that, and we talk about bias. So going forward, the way the world works these days is, you're right, you will end up with the credit offers that have been put in front of you, just because of how our browsers and everything work these days. So on one hand, there's rightly a focus on the credit assessment and making sure it's fair and transparent, but there are people who will never end up at your doorstep because the marketing piece is geared a certain way. So that's always a question that I'm wondering about.
Which is where we get to the governance and regulatory part on how we're going to be able to audit and assess whether these tools are fair or not.
Right, exactly. And how do you, it's easy to say, is the credit assessment fair? But on the other hand, is the way that you're marketing, even like if you're putting out like credit offers through Facebook digital marketing, how do you say if that's fair? Like, even for me, I'm not sure. So experts on the panel, like, how would you even govern that? Does that make sense? Like, how do you say I gave the right Facebook sort of digital marketing AI-driven offers to the right group, and was that unfair? That's, even for me, I don't even know. I don't know how to address that. So I'll be waiting to learn.
Actually, it's a very interesting point you raise, Michelle. Fairness in marketing is actually a very difficult one to crack. We can look at fairness in credit, and I'll come to that shortly. But fairness in marketing is difficult because marketing by definition is selective. So you have a pool of 100 people and you're going to shortlist, say, 10 people out of that. And whatever means you use, whether it is profiling based on income or age and employment status, whatever means you use, you're being selective. And the moment you're talking of being selective, there is an element of bias, which may be justified, which may not be justified, and it's difficult to quantify. A lot more defined and easier in the case of credit decisioning. So I don't have an answer there. I'm just saying that it's a difficult one.
I would hazard to say probably nobody does yet, but.
Great.
And I think the other question is too, is that, I mean, what regulators at this point possess the capability in terms of both knowledge, personnel, and experience to really look at these models and determine, okay, even if a company is going to hand over the model for examination or audit or whatever we want to call it, how many regulators have the bandwidth, knowledge, experience, and personnel to even audit this and tell you if it's this one's okay, this one is not, right? And how do they determine that? That's another huge knowledge gap that's sitting there, and a huge personnel and talent gap that's going to need to be brought to the fore and brought to fruition over the course of the next, 5 years or so, in order to catch up. And it's going to have to be within the next 5 years. Otherwise, the genie's going to be out of the bottle, and it's going to be very difficult to regulate back into it. Right. So that's another area that needs to be addressed, so there's a large skill gap that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that point. As a regulator, I would say it's impossible for regulators to catch up with all technologies. So we think that we have to change the mindset that, we regulator cannot see everything, understand everything. So instead, we regulators should encourage, incentivize developers or business sectors to do their own governance. So regulator will shift from rule setter to more like an incentive giver or incentive designer, and that's why we need innovative governance model, which is more incentive-based, governance process-based, and also we should redesign the second system. That's what we discussed in Japan.
Interesting point, Hiroki. And given we have Danielle here, and the previous session today was by Zhuchun, who's from MAS, and he runs Project Veritas. Now, 3 years back, MAS was the first regulator to actually introduce principles for the safe use of AI. So those are called the FEAT principles: fairness, ethics, accountability, and transparency in the use of AI. And subsequently, MAS set up a consortium of banks and technology companies in Singapore to work out how do we interpret those principles and how do we implement them. So I find that quite innovative. I have not seen other regulators actually, collaborate with the industry to define the regulatory principles, which was the first step, and they were the first to actually come out with, and then set up a consortium so that we have a consistent way of interpreting and implementing it. So last year, the consortium came out with a white paper on how to implement fairness in AI machines. And one of the cases we looked at was credit decisioning. Standard Chartered were part of it. And we also absorbed some of it internally. And this year, we're looking at transparency. So when it comes to fairness of credit decisioning model, let me take a couple of minutes and actually talk about a use case within the bank. We are starting to use AI in a challenger mode for credit decisioning. And this is mainly because we find portions of the population who are applying don't have sufficient credit bureau data. They are new to the industry, they are new to the city, they are just entering their careers, so they don't have the kind of credit history, and they could get rejected. So in terms of making better business sense and in terms of financial inclusion, it makes sense to somehow bring these people in because they're potentially good people to have as customers. So we're looking to enrich the data we have with externally sourced data and use AI techniques for assessment. Fairness was an important consideration. And how did we go about it? We started off looking at the data quality aspects, removing protected variables like gender and ethnicity and those kind of protected variables that can cause discrimination from the data set. We then check for proxy. So do you have some other variable that could be a proxy for gender? For example, some of the AI systems can pick up that if a person studied in a women's only university, they will associate that with gender somehow. They'll correlate that. So we managed to eliminate that. We then ran the model and brought gender, for example, back into the results to see whether there was any bias. Okay, that way it allowed us to quantify. Are we approving women at the same rate as we are approving men, for example? So we were able to do that and assess whether it was unjust. So you have techniques for this. We have worked with MAS in coming up with these techniques. And a lot of it is driven by explainability of the underlying model. Can you look into the black box? Can you establish what are the top features that are driving your model? Is income important, or is your postcode important, or whatever? So in summary, it's difficult, especially in the credit decisioning space, but it is doable. You have to make sure that at the input stage, at the processing stage, you debias your data and your algorithms, and you continue to monitor for any unjust bias on an ongoing basis. So I just thought I would add our experience based on how we are using credit decisioning with AI in a challenger mode, and also how we are ensuring that we check for bias and continue to check for unjust bias on an ongoing basis.
If I could add to that, I think that the opportunity to use AI in credit decisioning is one of the most promising use cases in the financial realm for the reasons that you cited. And by the way, I would agree that MAS is widely recognized as a leading regulator in the world in the sophistication of really everything they're doing with technology, including AI. And there is research emerging that is very promising about the use of AI-driven underwriting models being both more inclusive and also more predictive too, especially if you combine it with traditional underwriting information. And we've also seen through COVID that a lot of these models have really performed well in a credit downturn scenario, which has been sort of always been one of the issues cited for skepticism about them. You know, they may be fine when everyone's doing well, but how are they going to perform if they're really stressed? So, and I think that your model of using a challenger AI to sort of police the risk assessing AI, I think this is one of the most promising ways of getting good governance into this entire process.
Yeah, and thank you, Vijay, for highlighting this issue about using it in a challenger mode. One of the best practices we teach in pretty much every type of workshop we do with a financial institution is pretty much everything you do, you should be doing in a champion challenger, A/B test, everything you do, right? You're not just going to launch 100% some system. Everything is in a champion challenger mode. And by the way, Hiroki, in your paper, I also noticed you had some very nice elements of that test and learn flavor. And I think that to your point, Joanne, that probably is a big enabler to get from here to there, to always have that mindset.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. Maybe later, if I have time, I'm happy to introduce our framework. But just at one point, Vijay's, the point that, sometimes when we say human-centric society, we misunderstand the word like, in the end, human beings have to check everything. But we don't believe that is the right way. Sometimes, AI can detect the wrongful conducts or mistakes much better than human beings. So it's a very dangerous concept that all human beings have to check in the end. But human beings are just the goals of governance, but not the method of the governance necessarily.
I think that's a very powerful point you make, Hiroki, and I agree with that. And it is also in line with our thinking that properly governed with sufficient guardrails, AI can be a source for good. And if you look at what MAS is doing, their intent towards putting in place the FEAT principles was not to stop the use of AI. It was to promote the use of AI. It was to promote innovation. Reality is that tech companies are snapping at our heels. So the banks are under constant pressure from tech companies that are entering into the financial services space. And they have tremendous technological advantages, and they're not bound by the kind of regulations. So MAS is actually trying to push us in a way where we can use AI safely. So if you add fairness and transparency to that mix, you actually have a competitive advantage. You can gain the trust of your customers by using AI in a safe and effective manner. And we don't need to look any further than what's happening between, say, Apple and Facebook. So from a data privacy perspective, Apple is taking a completely different stance than Facebook is. And it is able to gain the trust of customers. And 10 years back, banks were seen as evil. Now technology companies are being seen as evil. Okay. And it is companies like Apple who are going after the increasingly data savvy, privacy aware customers that can use AI safely. And that's the kind of thinking MAS also brings to the table while putting out these governance mechanisms. So fully agree, we cannot be having humans review everything that an AI does. We can use AI safely and effectively. Like I said, we have checks for fairness. We are trying to put in place transparency principles and so on. So very powerful point. Thank you for that, Hiroki.
Thank
you. I actually think there's a lot of risk that the governmental response to this will be to sort of try to dumb down the AI so that we can understand it with our human brains. And when we say explainability, what does that mean? Does that mean that we really have to be able to understand all the logic on what the algorithm looked at and how it analyzed it? Or might it mean that we need to be sure that we're confident in something like a challenger AI that is policing it? Because if we make it to, some of you are more expert in this than I am, but my expert friends in AI talk about the fact that in many cases there's an inverse relationship between predictiveness and explainability. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the AI is getting it right for reasons that are not intuitive to us. And so I think that it's a cautionary note for government and for governance to not to try to make it too so transparent that we all completely understand what it's doing.
We actually have a very interesting scenario here in Canada where starting, I believe, next year, if you have been identified as not worthy of credit by an institution via the analysis from an AI-based system, the bank must explain to you the operation of that system and why you were rejected. So there's a really good example now of consumer law coming into effect or consumer guardianship by regulation, essentially coming in to say that, okay, if you're going to use an AI to refuse credit to somebody, you better be able to explain to them why that AI excluded them. Now I think number one, it's not going to be that easy for it to manage. I don't think it's going to be that easy for it to go and be put into act. But I gotta commend the idea behind it. I mean, if you think about it, you can imagine the situation where somebody's in there talking to their loan officer at a bank or someone and saying, you got to explain why this thing didn't let me get a loan, and how. The person behind the desk is probably not an AI expert, right? So that's going to force the bank into, I guess there's going to be two positions. One, people simply fight against the regulation, probably to no avail, or the banks are going to have to ensure that the model is simple enough that it can be explained by essentially a layman to a consumer, right? So does that mean the AI is going to be dumbed down? can you simplify something, while dumbing it down, or make it more complex while dumbing? I don't know. That's going to be an interesting balance for people to happen. But that's happening here in Canada, like now, imminently, and it's going to be an interesting use case. I don't know how that's being done elsewhere in the world. I can't imagine Canada is the only one doing that at this point. But I'd love to hear some commentary on that and what the potential effects of that could be.
I'll just say quickly, there's a version of that in the United States, not a new law, but we've always had a law saying that when people are denied a loan or get adverse terms, they have a right to a disclosure of the reasons for denial. And the laws and regulations are written with categories of reasons that are left over from the analog age. And so there's a lot of thinking going into how can you create a useful disclosure to the consumer. Something, the point of it is they should be able to fix their problem or challenge it if it's unfair. And if it just says, well, the machine says so, it's useless to them. So a lot of work to do on that.
Mm-hmm.
I think, again, very interesting points that both Michael and Joanne raised. And I know I'm hogging the microphone today, but there's so much here that's actually happening as we are working on Project Veritas. We are working on transparency this year. And like you said, do you want to dumb down the model such that it can be explained to a layperson who's not tech savvy? The answer is no, because then your model would not be sophisticated enough to generate the kind of results that you're looking at. So we are trying to strike a balance, and hopefully we'll have some good answers by the end of this year when the report is to be released. A couple of thoughts we have. There are various kinds of explainability in terms of looking at what the AI model is doing and what drives its behavior. And one of them is what we call counterfactual explainability. What that means is you were rejected credit. What must you do in order to flip that decision? So rather than try to explain the model, it's the point Joanne was making. What kind of action can you take based on the reasons we are giving you? So you could say that, for example, reduce your tenor of the loan you're applying for by 6 months. That's the kind of counterfactual information. But you could end up giving some rubbish output like reduce your age by 10 years because so how do you actually balance that? And there are some areas where you don't want to be transparent. So especially in areas like, say, fraud detection or anti-money laundering, you don't want to explain how your AI works to others because there are bad actors out there who could game your system and completely bypass the kind of controls you're putting in place. So we got to strike a balance. And again, going back to Joanne's points, the laws that were made in the analog age need to be revisited. One area I can think of is just look at the no-fly lists. What's the kind of transparency you have there in terms of what is the logic for putting someone on a no-fly list? What is the process for getting someone out of it, proving that you got the wrong person? And that's nothing to do with AI. It is a completely analog process today. So bringing it into a banking credit scenario, why was I rejected credit? We could potentially give information. And most of the regulators are asking for channels of redress. How do I actually flip that decision? So the thinking is in that direction about providing transparency on a risk-based approach and providing redress channels. There's no point telling someone, these are the 10 reasons why you were rejected. From a financial inclusion perspective, can we actually switch that conversation and say, you do these things, you close 3 of your existing credit cards, for example, or reduce the loan amount that you're asking for, we can have a different conversation. So that's where I think we should be looking at.
Yeah, exactly. I think Vijay has shared a lot on Project Veritas, and thanks for actually helping us to promote this. And actually, from the AI development perspective, well, we see a lot of AI applications across financial industry, and it really goes back to the use case itself. Some of the use case will requires great level of explainability in order to be success. While some of the use cases may not. It could be, as Vijay said, it's AML kind of thing that we don't want to have that levels of explainability. It could be in investment where I've been working in parts of my careers where certain type of like just predict the price movement. It doesn't really require a lot of experiment, but it requires the accuracy. So it really comes back to the use case itself. Then we will, I think that's also some great practice for data scientists to understand the context of use case and then choose the right model, choose the right algorithm to actually building the AI model. So that's a part of the summary that I would like to also tap on this discussion. So I think we still have 10 minutes left, and I think everyone wants to hear about from Hiroki the governance practice on this very interesting model. Maybe Hiroki, you can take the chance to share a bit more about.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving me the time. Now I'm trying to share my slide. And I try my best to make it quick. Sorry, which one? Yes. So can I see my slide now?
No. Yes.
Yes, now we can.
Okay.
Yes. Looks good. So recently we published a report titled Governance Innovation Version 2, a guide to designing and implementing agile governance. And let me just briefly explain the basic concept. Okay. So last year we published version 1, this year version 2. And this report consists of 4 chapters. In chapter 1, we discussed what is Society 5.0, which Japan is pursuing. Basically, this means, a society where the human being's happiness or liberty is maximized through cyber-physical technologies, of course, including AI. And in chapter 2, we discuss how our society is changing, just as we discussed now, because of the characteristics of technology of AI or other IoT systems. Our society is changing rapidly, and which is in a different way compared with the previous society, which is fast-changing, complex, and uncertain. And in third chapter, we discussed about the goals. As just mentioned in the previous discussion, we place the ultimate objective of our governance as liberty or freedom of human beings. And we have, of course, human rights or economic growth to support those humans' liberty or happinesses. And to achieve these different goals simultaneously, we need some more flexible and swift and cooperative governance model, which we call agile governance mechanism. And this is the basic concept of the agile governance. There are mainly 6 steps. So first, the governing actors should do the risk analysis, condition analysis, and then goal setting and system design. So here, system design means not only technological systems, but also rule making and organizational design. And when you implement the governance mechanisms, you always have to monitor your activities. So it's like a real-time monitoring. And also you have to make sure that you fulfill your accountability to third parties, stakeholders, because your system is always affecting to other systems in Society 5.0. Then you have 2 ways. The inner circle is evaluating whether the initially set goals are satisfied with the current system. And if it's not, you have to update your system. But you also have the outer circle, which is reanalysis of conditions, risks, or reset of goal. As I just mentioned in the previous discussion, the society is always changing, and the goals are always changing. So you always have to make sure that you the conditions, the risks is continuously reviewed by our multi-stakeholders. And this basic concept of agile governance is applicable to different governance mechanisms, such as corporate governance, regulation, infrastructure, market, and social norms. And on top of them, we need to implement governance of governance, which is to draw the overall picture of the entire governance mechanisms. In other words, to what extent the law should be provided, or to what extent the market mechanism should work, and what kind of infrastructure we need should be well designed. and we call it governance of governance. And this governance of governance mechanism also should be handled in the agile governance way, which is to continuously discussed and reviewed by multi-stakeholders. So this is a very brief summary of our concept of agile governance, and I'm very happy to apply this framework to actual examples which you have already experienced in the different fields. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very interesting too. When it comes to technology development, we have agile approach to actually to do the software development. Now we do have the agile framework models to actually implementing the governance. Anyone has any comments on that, or any questions to maybe Hiroki?
I'd be curious to hear from Danielle and Vijay how this compares to what similarities and differences you see to how things are being done in Singapore and Southeast Asia.
Vijay, you want to take that? Or
I am not able to hear Danielle.
Yeah, I had a question for you. Do you see any similarities or differences between this agile approach as compared to what we see in Southeast Asia? It does seem a bit different, right?
I mean, agile as a technique is adopted. I think most of the companies and banks and financial institutions adopt it internally. So from a governance perspective, this is something that is new, I must say. I mean, we have been working with MAS, for instance, and like I said, Veritas is where we are trying to interpret and implement the FEED principles. And of course, there is an openness to feedback and so on. But I have to see how Agile works. And we also need to understand whether the entire ecosystem needs to be Agile for this to function effectively, as opposed to just one part of it. Bear in mind that at Standard Chartered, we operate in about 70 different jurisdictions: the UK, EU, US, Singapore, Hong Kong, India, and Middle East, Africa. So it's going to be interesting to see how this gets taken up, and it sounds very promising.
Yeah, maybe I can add on. So when we initiate Project Veritas, we actually, at the beginning, when we look at those principles and evaluation, we actually think about we need to make it more flexible. We couldn't just do a Singapore context to evaluate the fairness. So the principle is, get back to our discussion today, when we start with the key principles. Those are the universal principles that should be applied across. But in terms of detailed evaluation, the scoring, how fair it is, it will be vary from different society across jurisdiction. So Veritas is really focused on the methodology to do the assessment. But when it comes to the results, it will be more flexible for different organizations or regulators to actually interpret and make use of that. So it's really a tool. It's not serving the purpose of come out to say, oh, it will pass, it will just getting better. But I think it's really, I do see some types of like linkage between the agile governance, where it actually it comes to when we design certain policies at the beginning from the regulator perspective. That's a very interesting model from Hiroki.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So we have 2 more minutes towards the end of the forum. Thanks everyone for generous sharing. Any other last comments that you would like to make or points from?
I would just suggest that there are very few things that any of us are working on that are more important than this. And I really encourage people to elevate this on the agendas of their organizations and their own work. And really, we're going to need a full ecosystem community build to figure our way through all this in the coming years. And nothing could be, very little is more important, I think, to the future.
Agreed.
Well said.
Agreed. And to echo the points made at the beginning, that skills, understanding, and culture take time to change. So we are always working with skills and culture within the financial institutions, and it really takes time. You have to be patient but committed, and it needs to come from the top. So the senior executives really have to be on board and then send that downwards and really drive the culture change and understanding, and through training and activities, and then of course all the governance.
Thank you very much. I think we come to the end of the discussion. Maybe hand it over back to the host.
Thank you very much, everybody. It was a very insightful, interesting conversation. I think thank you, Danielle, for your contribution during the panel. I think it's actually been a very interesting chat for those that have logged in and are listening in. For those of our listeners that are logging in from Europe, well, thank you for being awake. But yes, I think we've come to the end of the panel. So again, thank you so much to everybody, to all the panel participants, and to Danielle for moderating it. I think our next panel will be a fireside chat covering sustainability and AI by Mr. David Hardoon of MAS, the Chief Data Officer of MAS. So please, for those that are interested, please log in and join that. Thank you for your time, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.